We had talked last week about the idea that I don't know if they are up to X, but I wouldn't put it past them. Right. And the relevance of the sympathy and empathy piece is that this is one of these places where I will speak, I know it's a fraught term, but I will speak of normies, right? I'm a normie in the sense that I have normal human emotions. I'm sure they don't map perfectly onto what other people experience, but I'm not lacking some large category of emotion. So if I run up against somebody who is of a fundamentally different nature, if I run up against, let's say, somebody who is sociopathic, right? So they are lacking in what I would call sympathy, what others often call empathy. I will misunderstand their behavior until I correct for that, right? Because I will expect them to do what I would do in their shoes, and they have a whole range of things they can do that I can't. So the importance of the concept we introduced last time, I don't know if they're doing X, but I wouldn't put it past them, is that if you recognize that there are two questions on the table when we're trying to figure out, you know, why did the official bodies recommend shots that they misportrayed as vaccines that did a tremendous amount of damage? Were they just in error? Did they fail to see it? Or were they willing to do damage? And the answer is, I don't know the answer to that question, but I wouldn't put it past them, right? Mm-hmm. So the point here, the piece of toolkit that I want to add this week is there is something that I would call a simplifying assumption. A simplifying assumption is some assumption that when you map it onto a set of observations, it makes explaining what you see easier rather than harder. It doesn't add another layer of complexity. Complexity drops away. And so the idea of, if I say, I don't know if they are doing X, but I wouldn't put it past them, does that actually allow me to understand my world better if I imagine that they are de facto sociopathic and that they may not be doing X because they lack the capacity or they think they would get caught, but there's no limit to their willingness to do the kind of harm in question? I would argue that we understand recent history vastly better. Mm-hmm. Now, somebody will likely raise the objection to this, that actually I've cheated. That if the point is, if I imagine that they are lacking moral constraint, if the competing hypothesis of I wouldn't put it past them, they're capable of anything, morally speaking, is that they live by a moral code, right? So the question is, which of these two assumptions explains the world we now live in better? And it may be that vast sections of the world are explained by one, and you get to some zone and it turns out that the utility of that model breaks down and you need to imagine a moral code is in place. The original point was simplifying assumption. We are dealing with something. We may not know who exactly we're dealing with. We may not know whether they're doing certain things or those things are just happening of their own accord, but are the people who are steering the ship capable of doing absolutely ghastly things that a normal person would never contemplate, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know if they're doing it, but I wouldn't put it past them. And the answer is that does appear to be a functional simplifying assumption. The world makes more sense when you imagine that the people steering it are effective psychopaths. Mm-hmm. Now, some will say that I've cheated because imagining that some group of people doesn't have a constraint on it seems like, well, how could that possibly, even if it's not true, it will at worst explain the world at exactly the same level. And every so often it will explain something more because it's a lack of a constraint. But that's not, in fact, true in this case. If you, let's say you're married to a wonderful person, as I am.
I am too.
Oh, we're having a lovely moment here at Dark Horse. Let's imagine you are, as I am and as you claim to be, married to a wonderful person. And you imagine, well, what if they're really a monster, and they're just pretending to be a good person because that's to their advantage, right? And if you try to explain their day-to-day behavior in this way, you will find it is not a good match. In fact, it just makes the world seem crazy. You know, a monster who's so well behaved day in and day out and never,
and it will destroy the relationship.
Yeah. Well, as a test of a hypothesis, it's a good one. Go through it and you'll find, oh, yeah, it just doesn't last 5 minutes, right? It's just not a viable explanation. So what that proves, in addition to the magnetism of my glasses, is that it is not inherently, this is a simplifying assumption that is a fairly high bar. And the fact that it seems to match the world that we encounter with respect to major policy.
Okay, then it's not an assumption. Then you're saying it's effectively a hypothesis.
It starts out as a hypothesis. So when I say simplifying assumption, what I'm saying is you take it and instead of, if you include it as an assumption and it's wrong, you're in big trouble. So you can't do that. So what do? My point is you take what might be a useful assumption. We're being steered by psychopaths. And you try it out as a hypothesis. And you just say, if I map that onto the world, does it make the world simpler or more complicated? All right? If it makes it more complicated, it's not a good assumption. If it makes the world simpler and it's not a cheat, then that probably indicates something powerful. And that is all I'm suggesting, that you in the audience take this potentially simplifying assumption, try it, convert it into a hypothesis, and walk through your life and see whether or not it predicts the behavior of the public structure better than the idea that the public structure, you know, how likely is it that the CDC is acting out of what they call an abundance of caution, and it's obsessed with making you healthier? I don't know. How'd they miss vitamin D, right? Is it really likely that an organization that was obsessed with my health would have missed the low-hanging fruit that is vitamin D, right? Never mind whether you think vitamin D supplements work, which they seem to. Even if all the CDC did was it said, hey, check your latitude. Just check where you live on the earth. If you live above whatever the line on the globe is, then you should be aware you're probably vitamin D deficient for 2 reasons. One, the sun doesn't get high enough in the sky for you to be making vitamin D for a large portion of the year. 2, it probably gets cold enough that you're wearing a lot of clothing, you're sitting inside where the climate is regulated, and these things are all interfering with a very natural process that is fundamental to immunity, right? The CDC doesn't understand this. It's like really, you know, interested in me taking inoculations built on novel technologies that interfere with the way my immune system works, but it hasn't noticed vitamin D. No, that is much better explained by the fact that this entity, even though it claims to be about disease control, doesn't really care to control disease.
It's more about human control or pharmacological control, right, rather than disease control.
Exactly. Which then just, you know, the point is, okay, if I don't have to worry, if I have to worry that the CDC is obsessed with my health and that it just gets everything wrong, that's a hard thing to explain. Everything wrong? Really? That's weird. On the other hand, if I think, oh, well, what if actually it's under the control of an industry that profits when I'm not well? Well, that makes a lot of sense. Right now, the only thing I've got to explain is how it retains the name that leads me to believe it's obsessed with making me healthy, and that's pretty easy to explain, right? It's a much better sales pitch if, you know, these people can cloak themselves in, you know, in doctor's garb.
And that's the piece where a lot of people get stuck, right? But it's called the CDC. It's called the FDA. It's called the NSF. It's called the government of the United States of America. It's Stanford. It's Harvard. It's, you know, the NIH. It's these bastions that are old and esteemed and important and iconic, and the label does not match the contents. That is not exactly the phrase that you started using.
The label on the box doesn't match the contents.
Yeah, that is the thing, and that is the piece that people will get stuck on. They will say, "Well, yes, I understand." Everyone will agree that systems can be corrupt, right? That there can be corrupted systems that pretend that they are trying to help you, but are actually trying to do the opposite. Everyone knows that is theoretically a possibility. The place that this hiccups, that a lot of people got incredibly confused, for instance, during COVID, and have failed to get unconfused, is that they still believe that the label on the box matches what the box used to contain. That Stanford is still Stanford, Harvard, NSF, the executive branch of the American government, the Democrats, everything. And why? Why do you assume that it's the same that it used to be, when all of the evidence suggests that it's not?